Good evening. It's been a while since the last video. We have a new Prime Minister and a new monarch, yet absolutely nothing's changed, at least not for the better. So where are we headed as a nation? Let's discuss. So it's been about 3 months since my last video. There'll be an explanation for the absence at the end of this video, but an enormous amount has taken place in that time, not least of which is the tragic passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, as depicted here in a touching mural painted outside a London tube station in tribute. Now, although her reign did see the total economic, cultural, social and political decline of her kingdom, the one thing you can say about her is that she wasn't politically outspoken, aside from when she implied that the unvaccinated were selfish cowards, but for the most part she was neutral and non-partisan, as she clearly understood constitutional convention. Which isn't something that can be said about King Charles III, God save him. From his extensive green campaigning for net zero, including just this summer when he used the heatwave to claim that he was right about climate change, to his exploitation of COVID in 2020 to promote the World Economic Forum's Great Reset agenda.
We have a golden opportunity to seize something good from this crisis. Its unprecedented shockwaves may well make people more receptive to big visions of change.
Welcome to 2030, folks. You'll own nothing and be happy. And of course, whilst Charlie prances about in the limelight with his environmentally friendly cheese and wine-powered Aston Martin, behind the scenes he takes flights in his private jets and helicopters about once a fortnight to avoid getting stuck in traffic. But of course, his green agenda partisanship hasn't been his only breach of constitutional neutrality. He has a lengthy record of interfering with governments, from his pressuring John Major's government into granting a specific exemption to his estates in a leasehold reform statute to prevent tenants from having the right to buy their homes, to his infamous Black Spider memos, correspondence with Tony Blair's government in which he pressured the health secretary to accelerate the redevelopment of a hospital site in which his own architecture charity was involved, and lobbying Blair directly to replace military helicopters being used in Iraq. He's also reportedly lobbied various authoritarian Middle Eastern monarchies on behalf of British arms manufacturers, and just recently he meddled when he condemned the government's Rwanda plan for channel migrants, for the same reason as the left-wing press, rather than the £120 million price tag, not including the cost of transporting these migrants and housing them in luxury hotels with swimming pools and golf courses, which we would have also had to pay for, nor the geopolitical sensibilities, with Rwanda's unlawful support for foreign rebels reaching American attention. And of course their military cooperation with Mali, which as I've mentioned previously is an ally of Russia. Charles has of course voiced his opposition to Russia, comparing Putin to Hitler back in 2014 in response to the Crimean Parliament accepting Russian military support for their independence referendum, for reasons that should be clear to anyone who watched my video about Ukraine and the war in the Donbass. Though despite his willingness to insult world leaders in breach of constitutional convention, you certainly can't accuse him of prejudice against the Russians, considering his controversial offer last year to meet a Russian banker who donated £500,000 to his foundation, though the donation later had to be returned due to ethical concerns. Similar controversy surrounded a several £1 million donation from the Qatari Prime Minister stuffed inside suitcases and carrier bags, and the offer of a knighthood made to a Saudi donor, reportedly without Charles's knowledge, but it's not outside the realm of plausibility that he knew, considering the honorary knighthood given to another Saudi donor during a state visit in 2015, which he failed to disclose on official reports of the trip. And then there's the recent emergence of the fact that he accepted £1 million from the Bin Laden family, which had come as no surprise to those of you who are aware of the West's relations with CIA agent Osama and co, right up until the moment he gave an interview with CNN declaring a jihad against the United States, shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union.
You have declared a jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Here's an example of the West's coverage of Osama prior to the initiation of Gladio B, in The Independent, December 6, 1993. Anti-Soviet warrior puts his army on the road to peace. With his high cheekbones, narrow eyes and long brown robe, Mr. Bin Laden looks every inch the mountain warrior of Mujahideen legend. Chador children danced in front of him. Preachers acknowledged his wisdom. "We've been waiting for this road through all the revolutions in Sudan," a sheikh said. "We waited until we had given given up on everybody, and then Osama bin Laden came along. This is aged about as well as the article The Mirror published only a couple of weeks ago about Diana's death not being an accident. I imagine the editor's probably already in the tower by now. And of course, in addition to his support for totalitarian global agendas, cordial relations with alleged false flag terrorists, and alleged murder of his ex-wife, all of which make him a great fit for leader of the Anglican Church, there's also his close personal friendship with Jimmy Savile, but you already know about that. Not that any of that matters, because he's effectively above the law, and he also won't have to pay a penny of inheritance tax on his mother's fortune. That's fair and just. And of course, all members of Parliament, our representatives and policymakers, have to swear an oath of allegiance to World Economic Forum Charlie. What a free and democratic country this is. And if you don't like it, you better keep it to yourself, judging by the numerous arrests of anti-monarchy demonstrators, such as this protester who was escorted away for holding a sign which read, "Not my king." Obviously a lot swifter than they were at removing the Insulate Britain protesters who actually interfered with ordinary citizens' daily lives. Another protester's been charged with a public order offence for holding a sign reading "Abolish Monarchy," and one man was threatened with arrest for holding a blank sign.
So just to confirm, you're not going to give me your details?
I was holding up a blank sign. Okay. Why are you asking for my details?
You said you're going to write stuff on it that may offend people.
I said I was going to write "Not my king" on a sign, and you asked for my details.
It may offend someone.
Who's that going to offend?
Don't know. Someone may
Not my king.
But remember, we're so much better than authoritarian Russia. Another man was arrested and subsequently de-arrested after shouting "Who elected him?" And then there's the kid who heckled Prince Andrew. As you can see, in full view of the police officers, he was dragged away by royalists and thrown to the ground. And then, still in full view of the police, they repeatedly shove him, which is a common assault. Yet they arrest the kid, who's now due to appear in court on public order charges. What a great use of public resources in the middle of a cost of living crisis. But it's not all bad. The timing of the announcement of the Queen's death couldn't have been any more convenient, with the mourning period forcing postponements to the Bank of England's decision on another interest rate rise, and investigations into MPs and parliamentary staff for bullying, corruption and sexual offences. And of course, Parliament's due to be out until mid-October now due to the party conferences, so no legislating new support for households. Ironically, the initial announcement of the Queen's poor health came during Liz Truss's announcement of energy support. More on that in a minute, but before I discuss the new Prime Minister, I never got the chance to discuss the downfall of the old one, who suddenly resigned immediately after surviving a confidence vote. The official reason the public were led to believe, or at least the final nail in the coffin, was the suspension of yet another Tory party official, Deputy Chief Whip Chris Pincher, over groping allegations, in addition to another 2 humiliating by-election defeats. However, perhaps more significant was a quietly brewing scandal which has since been almost entirely memory hold. It began with a story published in an early print edition of The Times and then immediately dropped, reporting that Boris had attempted to secure a senior Foreign Office job for Carrie, who he was having an affair with at the time whilst married to his previous wife. The Private Eye followed this up with allegations that Downing Street had pressured The Times into dropping the story, which Downing Street later confirmed was indeed the case. But they also asserted that the reason for The Times being pressured into dropping the story wasn't because of Boris's efforts to secure a job for Carrie, but due to a reference to an MP discovering the affair after walking in on the two in a compromising position. Who was that MP? Well, it's long been reported that Gavin Williamson holds dirt on Boris, and this would provide some form of explanation as to why he was awarded a knighthood earlier this year after a record of being sacked from both the Ministry of Defence and Education Ministry for various cock-ups. It could also potentially explain how he got his position as Education Secretary in the first place, which would of course amount to grand-scale corruption. But there's no way of confirming whether the MP really was Williamson, as Boris resigned and the story went very quiet. And so he rides off into the sunset with his £250,000 redundancy pay to face no justice for his acts of corruption and treachery. His only notable achievement was Brexit, and even that's been totally betrayed. The public voted for Brexit after being told it would allow us to take back control of our laws, cut unnecessary EU red tape and regulation, and take back control of our borders. Yet the government still voluntarily implements EU nanny state regulations, such as the proposals to add mandatory speed limiters to all new vehicles, and in fact goes further, such as by banning the sale of all new petrol and diesel cars from 2030. California's just announced a ban on new petrol cars from 2035. When Conservative Party Britain implements more progressive policy than Democratic Party California, you know our present form of democracy is a joke. And in regards to taking back control of our borders, so far in 2022, the UK's seen more migrants crossing the channel illegally than in the entirety of 2021, with the border force totally failing at their jobs. Over 50 migrants aged over 30 were recorded as children upon arrival, and the Home Office has come under fire for failing to take photographs or fingerprints, with hundreds of illegal migrants having disappeared from their hotels. Yes, they're luxury 4-star hotels, which cost the taxpayer close to £1 billion last year, and that's just the hotel bills. It doesn't include, for example, the £39,000 spent on Domino's Pizza for migrants at just one facility, right in the middle of the cost of living crisis. Meanwhile, vulnerable children in care are being kept in caravans and boats. And rather than terrified refugees fleeing from an active war zone, the largest group of channel migrants are Albanians. Yet the fact that Albania isn't a war zone shouldn't matter too much, considering around 90% of migrants refused asylum are still being allowed to remain in the UK, and only 21 illegal migrants have been removed under the post-Brexit asylum rules of returning to a safe third country. Yep, Boris sure kept his promises, didn't he? Yet despite his record, he clung to power because there was no viable alternative. He's the best the Tory party has to offer, with polls revealing Tory members still preferred him to Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, and some members calling for a vote to keep Boris. There's even rumours of a plot amongst Conservative MPs to restore Boris via a confidence vote in his successor. The fact that Boris Johnson is the best our system has to offer really speaks volumes about the efficacy of that system. In the words of Christ, "By their fruits ye shall know them. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire." It really speaks volumes that the news of Boris's resignation saw the pound jump against the dollar, only for the announcement of the new Prime Minister seeing it crash to its lowest level against the dollar since 1985. And you can hardly blame investors for being a little shaky when that new Prime Minister is Liz Truss. I've briefly discussed her record previously on this channel, such as when she gave a speech calling for fiscal responsibility, a slimmed down public sector and conservative values, right before she squandered 650 grand of public money on a global LGBT conference and $500,000 on a single private flight to Australia, in addition to her pushing for a new royal yacht. She's claimed to have pushed for a slimming down of the civil service and scrapping of woke positions, yet rejected calls from Boris for reductions in her own department, and in fact sought to expand the Foreign Office. In her leadership campaign, she tried to position herself as a Brexiteering libertarian, yet she backed Remain in 2016. And just like our last Prime Minister, she's another serial adulterer who can't even be trusted to tell the truth to her own husband, let alone the British public. Now, we all know Liz likes to model herself on Thatcher, who won public support and electoral success through war, and in addition to further inflaming the Russia-Ukraine situation by calling for fighter jets to be sent to Ukraine and publicly announcing her support for British fighters travelling to fight in Ukraine, it appears she wants hostilities with another superpower, in case the Russian one falls through, I guess. She's announced her intention to declare China an official threat for the first time. Maybe she's just salty over the Chinese Communist Party's official Wikipedia equivalent only mentioning that she's been sanctioned by Russia, but not that she imposed sanctions on Russia, though it's hardly surprising from a third-party standpoint considering how the Russian economy is performing compared with the British economy. Either way, she thinks she can defeat the Chinese army with their cutting-edge supersonic torpedo missiles that can fly in air and glide underwater, with our aircraft carriers that break down because someone forgot to grease the propeller shaft, soldiers who complain about the lack of plant-based options and demand vegan uniforms, paratroopers who host gay orgies in their barracks, and an air force that suspended all job offers for white men to meet diversity targets. Our navy can't even defend our own borders, and our army can't even defend their own Twitter account. And you know Truss's reasoning isn't due to any kind of ideological incompatibility with the Chinese regime, as she was recently heard in leaked audio suggesting that the British workforce were too lazy and should be more like the Chinese. Nothing new, of course, if you recall Michael Gove's calls for British schools to be modelled on Chinese schools back when he was Education Secretary. It's just ironic that our intelligence agencies are warning of China's online influence, whilst our government launched TikTok accounts. She also claimed to be the insurgent candidate, yet she and her entire cabinet, Therese Coffey, Kwasi Kwarteng, James Cleverly, Suella Braverman, Jacob Rees-Mogg, all voted for mandatory vaccine passports last December. That's the one thing you can say about Rishi. He didn't vote for those measures in Parliament, and during his leadership campaign he was fairly vocal about his opposition to lockdowns, and spoke out about the silencing of dissenting voices and failure to carry out any form of cost-benefit analysis when it came to introducing new measures, in addition to the government's unethical fear campaign. Whilst obviously preferable to Liz Truss, why didn't Rishi speak out at the time instead of going along with it and implementing some of the most radical socialist economic policies in British history, the result of which being that the national deficit soared from £38 billion to £327 billion, and remaining higher than expected this summer. Partly as a result of us sanctioning ourselves over the Russo-Ukrainian war, energy bills have skyrocketed, with the national price cap hiked to £3,500 and forecasts of bills reaching £7,000 by next year, with talk of potential energy rationing and the government planning for blackouts. All of this is, of course, the price we must pay for resisting the evils of Putin and standing up for the democracy and freedom of a regime that bans its largest opposition parties, revokes the right to vote from regions that vote wrong, and bombards those regions with indiscriminate artillery fire when they try to organise their own elections. Just remember, the threat from Putin the Nazi outweighs the pain of rising energy bills. Zelensky says so. Still, it's not exactly a good look for the government when the public face freezing over energy bills, whilst the government sends countless billions in military aid to a foreign war zone. With the discontent that had been rising against the previous government, everyone knew Liz's first priority would have to be getting bills back under control. But how? The Labour Party had called for a further windfall tax to fund a price cap freeze, but anyone who isn't totally economically illiterate realises how damaging and unsustainable such a move would be, judging by, for example, Norway threatening to abandon North Sea oil drilling over a new windfall tax, and the wealthy families already fleeing Britain over high taxes. So with Liz having already ruled out any new taxes upon becoming Prime Minister, what could she announce? The same kind of price cap Labour was proposing, cutting bills to £2,500, which is still double what they were last year, but paid for through borrowing another £150 billion, as if the national deficit wasn't out of control already. A true conservative economic plan, as she described this during her campaign. There's also no word on where she'll receive an additional £157 billion to increase defence spending, but I guess she'll just borrow that too. Why not? I guess the one positive we can say about Liz's government so far is that they're reportedly dropping their plans to scrap the Human Rights Act. What's slightly less positive, however, is Liz's confirmation that the Orwellian online safety bill will be carried forward. She's also announced that she's doubling down on Boris's net zero commitments, which will probably mean a continuation of such policies as paying off farmers to retire from farming and funneling large sums of public money into rewilding the land. All great for the food supply. And of course, she'll be continuing Boris's support for Ukraine. Truss represents a continuation of the Johnson government, given the fact that the majority of Tory members would have chosen Johnson and only picked Liz Truss as she was the most similar. And Liz knows this is her voter base, hence she reportedly tried to stop the Partygate investigation of Boris, so that he'll face no accountability whatsoever for his actions, just as nobody ever faced justice for the billions of pounds worth of faulty missold PPE that was eventually burned, or the billions of pounds embezzled from the Treasury through various improper public contracts. And it's unlikely that anyone will ever face justice for the immense harm caused by the government interventions. Nearly 500,000 more adults are on antidepressants than before the lockdowns, and the mental health of students has also declined, with some young children now starting primary school unable to say their own names. There's predictions that lockdown problem drinking will fuel a rise in deaths, and scientists now believe lockdowns to have been the cause of the mysterious outbreak of child hepatitis cases, due to children not having been able to develop a natural immunity to several usually harmless viruses. In fact, the effects of lockdown are feared to be killing more people than COVID itself, with excess deaths continuing to soar despite a drop in COVID deaths. There's even been reports of healthy young people dying suddenly from a mysterious condition, though the papers don't go quite so far as to suggest the likely cause. It's no longer just a so-called conspiracy theory anymore, judging by the numerous stories of disability and death directly caused by COVID vaccines, and the six-figure payouts being awarded to victims after proving that the harm was indeed the result of the vaccine. Meanwhile, the Express has been suggesting that blood clots can be caused by anything from dehydration to heat to drinking tea, and that cold showers can cause heart attacks. What a wonderful state of affairs. I guess the billions of pounds that went into R&D was money well spent. Just like the £200 million vaccine factory that was put up for sale after failing to produce a single dose. Not that that's prevented other vaccine factories from opening, nor has the government been dissuaded from approving Moderna's new dual variant jab targeting Omicron, despite the fact that Omicron has far lower mortality and hospitalisation rates than previous variants and is believed to be no more dangerous than an ordinary flu. Yet all over 50s are to be offered doses in the form of yet another booster, with GPs presumably still set to receive their £15 per dose administered. What a great use of public money at this point in the so-called pandemic. Just like the £2 billion spent on more testing kits earlier this summer. Money well spent. Meanwhile, the NHS are cutting cancer testing in order to fund staff pay rises, in spite of the fact that hospital treatment waiting lists have reached a record 6.8 million. Many people's inability to obtain a face-to-face appointment with their GP has been spun by a positive by the NHS for being environmentally friendly, even though it produces such results as teenagers committing suicide and patients being recommended end-of-life care after being falsely diagnosed with organ failure due to how the lighting made her appear on screen during a Zoom consultation. And despite our NHS's total failure to provide the most basic and essential care, they're reportedly still hiring diversity and inclusion managers to scrub all non-gender neutral language from official NHS guidance, and to ensure hospitals use such inclusive terms as birthing people instead of mothers. One male blood donor was prevented from giving blood after refusing to answer whether he was pregnant, placing political correctness and ideological conformity over their fundamental duty of saving lives. Yet that's where your money goes. The government sure knows how to spend your money wisely, from the £2 billion plan to boost cycling, resulting in the lowest cycling rates on record, to the £120 million festival of Brexit, boasting such attractions as a drag queen and trees on an oil rig. No, I can't figure out the target audience either, but I'm sure that too was money well spent. Whilst the nation faces a deep recession and the greatest drop in living standards on record, with inflation at a 40-year high of 10%, the worst inflation of a G7 nation, with food prices rising at the fastest rate since 2008, and inflation driving the fastest fall in real wages on record. With the rising energy prices, not only are 2/3 of families facing fuel poverty next year, but businesses from ice cream vans to fish and chip shops face annihilation. It's estimated that to meet the rising fuel costs, pubs will need to charge £20 for a pint, curry houses will need to charge £30 for a chicken korma, and restaurants will need to charge £100 for a steak, with over 70% of pubs facing closure this winter. Obviously, times are extremely tough, and the government are failing in their fundamental obligations to the British people. Hence, we've seen recent strike action from a whole range of different professions, including criminal barristers, train workers, tube workers, bus drivers, airport staff, dock workers, BT staff, Royal Mail staff, and bin men, with talk of potential future industrial action from university lecturers, GPs, and firefighters. Isn't it funny how there's no MP strike? The one group society would be better off without. Though I guess we got a glimpse of what a government strike would look like, judging by the fact that during the leadership election, the Foreign Secretary was entirely preoccupied with campaigning, whilst the Prime Minister was gallivanting about on various foreign holidays, and the Deputy Prime Minister was playing Laser Quest. Yet the country seemed no worse off than usual. I guess it goes to show which jobs are important, and which jobs the country can function perfectly fine without. Now, obviously these workers have the right to strike, and their motivations are entirely understandable, as it's not their fault the government's run the economy into the ground, so they shouldn't be punished for it through lower real wages. But remember that the vast majority of these workers sat by watching the groundwork for this catastrophe being laid because it didn't affect them. They received their furlough from the state or kept working as usual, oblivious to the disaster lurking around the corner. They didn't need to take to the streets then, as they themselves were perfectly comfortable, Yet as soon as the consequences of those policies began to impact their personal finances, only then did they take to the streets. And not in any sort of unified political movement to address the fundamental problem, but rather in scattered factionless trade unions, campaigning solely for pay rises in their own sectors, in spite of the obvious inflationary effect of such pay rises. So long as we're fine, sod everybody else, I guess. There's no unity in the face of an obvious common goal. The people remain divided, the system remains unthreatened, and absolutely nothing changes. Though with that said, some workers learned the hard way that parliamentary parties are not on their side, judging by Keir Starmer's sacking of one of his shadow cabinet ministers for attending a rail strike. Yes, the Labour Party leader sacked his shadow transport minister for attending a rail strike, in spite of a video that has since surfaced of Starmer promising to stand with strikers. As Gaddafi once said, a party that is formed in the name of a class inevitably becomes a substitute for that class and continues in the process of spontaneous transformation until it becomes hostile to the class that it replaces. He must have been talking about the British Labour Party, turning their backs on the working class in industrial disputes, and instead taking the knee for BLM and campaigning for new gender-neutral pronouns, with Starmer lacking the backbone to answer whether or not a woman has a penis. When will the public realise that none of the parasites in Parliament stand for your interests, unless you're a part of the new progressive generation, brainwashed through state-controlled education and media into advocating for more state control? That's not a condemnation of this generation. Don't be angry at the youths blocking milk supplies and motorways, smashing up petrol pumps and gluing themselves to old master paintings. They genuinely believe that humanity will perish if you don't join them in their crusade. They're the product of incessant brainwashing. I only recently found out that Sky News runs a daily climate show dedicated entirely to climate-related fear-mongering, with screens down the side displaying ticking counters for CO2 emissions and the global temperature change since 1880 to the 9th decimal place. Just as the press began covering the heatwave with over-the-top scary graphics and sensationalist analysis, suddenly Extinction Rebellion activists showed up at the offices of The Sun to completely smash the place up for the cardinal sin of having historically reported on warm weather in a not entirely negative manner. Listen to what this perfectly rational and independent-minded individual has to say about why his merry band of cultists want to reenact Kristallnacht.
News UK have consistently been printing articles like we see here of people like happy in the sun and like women in bikinis and totally making light of the situation. They're absolutely not providing people with the information that they need.
Though obviously I need to acknowledge how, if it was any other group, their actions would be roundly deemed fascistic. For example, notice how the media reported on the Extinction Rebellion protesters unveiling their banners in the House of Commons and gluing themselves to the Speaker's chair as peaceful protesters, when this was universally condemned as an attempted insurrection and an act of domestic terrorism. But although these eco-kids are de facto terrorists, they're not to blame when they're being brainwashed 24/7 into advancing the agendas of the elites who want to see you drinking sewage water and eating bugs and old wind turbines. Even coverage of positive events regarding the climate have to be reported with a sense of impending doom. For example, the Great Barrier Reef has seen record coral cover and has never been healthier, but a story like that contradicts the alarmist net zero agenda. So how did the press cover it? Sky News, record high coral on parts of Australia's Great Barrier Reef, though ecosystem remains vulnerable to heating. BBC, Great Barrier Reef sees record coral cover, but it is highly vulnerable. The Guardian, record coral cover on parts of Great Barrier Reef, but global heating could jeopardise recovery. The Telegraph, Great Barrier Reef bursts back to life, but climate change still poses a threat. The Times, vast recovery of coral cover on Australia's Great Barrier Reef, but threats still remain from climate change and starfish attacks. Free and independent media, huh? Have some consideration for the youth of today, and don't condemn them when they go astray. They're growing up in a cultural wasteland. When you look at the top 10 grossing movies at the worldwide box office this year, you'll see that 9 of the top 10 are either remakes, spin-offs, or sequels, with the only one that isn't being Chinese production Watergate Bridge. We've got songs from the 80s topping the charts, and an 80-year-old headlined at Glastonbury. The lucky youths who attended Glastonbury this year also got to hear Billie Eilish speaking out against the US Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade, because my body, my choice. Definitely not incompatible with her stance on COVID vaccines. It's not just for you, you selfish bitch. Plus, other stars appearing at Glastonbury included Zelensky on a large screen calling for attendees to spread the truth about Russia's invasion, and Greta Thunberg once again warning of the dangers of climate change. This is the biggest and most popular festival for young people in Britain, and like virtually all culture produced for young people today, it's full of political messages to teach the youths how to think. And youths are demonstrably absorbing what they're seeing, and demonstrating extremely dangerous and irresponsible behaviour as a result. Obviously far more extreme than the climate protesters is the number of children imitating dangerous stunts they see on TikTok. Most notably was Archie Battersby, who eventually had his life support turned off after becoming brain dead as a result of participating in a TikTok asphyxiation game known as the Blackout Challenge. According to Archie's mother, 82 children so far have died as a result of this one challenge alone, so not including other challenges such as the Skull Breaker Challenge, which recently caused a teenage girl to break her neck. There have also been concerns about the rise of anxious and unwell teenage posters who compete with one another to be seen as the most unwell, fueling a rise in anxiety in teenage girls. Generally, children learn by imitating the behaviour of others and by following the most socially praised and positively reinforced behaviours. Hence, following the momentous rise of drag-themed cultural properties and the promotion of drag events to children, such as the infamous Drag Queen Storytime for 3 to 11-year-olds, where at such family-friendly events, drag queens make sex jokes about teaching the children to open their legs, we're now seeing a rise in prepubescent young boys becoming sexualised drag queens, being celebrated in the press and further perpetuating the cycle. Another example was the 16-year-old boy who decided to wear a dress to his prom, receiving an enormous amount of praise and gushing headlines in the press such as "Boy in sequined prom dress living his best life." He received far more coverage and praise than another British teenager who just broke the world record of youngest person to circumnavigate the world solo. Now, which of these do you think young children will view as a greater achievement in society? As I've discussed previously, there appears to be at least a trend, if not an active effort, to emasculate young men, and the impact on young men's mental health is beginning to manifest, from the record rise of healthy weight children attempting to lose weight being driven almost entirely by young boys, to the rise in the numbers of young men finding themselves needing to use Viagra. And whilst kids are being taught complete nonsense, such as the World Health Organization's claims that there are more than 2 genders, or the Church of England's claims that there's no official definition of a woman, they're seeing transgender children being celebrated and walking the runway at New York Fashion Week, while such behaviour is also being encouraged on a local level, such as with the Scouts issuing trans fun and bisexual fun badges for children. And just look at the result. Around 50% of 18 to 24-year-olds know somebody who's transgender, compared with 10% for over 75s. Furthermore, over 60% of 18 to 24-year-olds believe a man is a woman if he feels like it, and vice versa, compared with below 45% for the general population. The schools are doing a good job, but clearly not good enough. Hence, our supposedly conservative government is allowing Ofsted to consider gender identity lessons in school grading, whilst exam boards appear to be validating such maladaptive behaviour through plans to record the exam results of non-binary students separately. Meanwhile, schools purge staff for such transgressions as expressing an opinion that drag queens are sexist, or for standing up for students' rights to question school LGBT policies. Meanwhile, these outspoken Maoist teachers lead witch hunts against students they deem far-right radicals for daring to question the far-left extremism being forced upon them. I use the word Maoist because this is literally what Mao did in the 50s. Students at one drama college have even been urged to report their teachers for so-called microaggressions, any slip-up or deviation from the approved ideology. Schools are fantastic places, or at least our government thinks so, with the Conservative-backed schools bill currently making its way through the Lords to crack down on homeschooling, with a compulsory register for all homeschooled children and new school attendance orders for compelling parents to send their children to state-run schools. Your children are going to learn about drag queens and transgenderism whether you like it or not. And who knows, maybe they'll go on to higher education to study an undergraduate course in Harry Styles or a PhD in masturbation. And if they do, don't worry, they won't be exposed to any challenging texts. All those horribly offensive old works by the likes of Shakespeare and Chaucer and Dickens have been dropped from their syllabuses. And this extreme inclusivity is being pushed on adults too, by the state no less. The majority of you have probably already seen the video of the army veteran being arrested over a social media post of a swastika arranged from LGBT flags, due to the fact that his post might cause offence. Due to public outcry, the Police and Crime Commissioner of Hampshire made a statement condemning the arrest, and Hampshire police have also dropped their hate crime awareness courses in the wake of the incident. Yet there's been no such official condemnation of the officers elsewhere, reducing the police force to a politicised joke by dancing at gay pride events instead of actually tackling crime. Ironically, in Lincoln, where the latest such incident took place, police are only solving less than 17% of robberies, 9% of burglaries, 6% of personal thefts, and less than 5% of bicycle thefts, yet the coppers dance on. In some constabularies, police are only sending officers to 1 in 4 burglaries, and in most areas, car thefts have been described as being effectively decriminalised, due to the incredibly low rates at solving such cases, with Hampshire, where the army veteran was arrested, having among the lowest rates of solving vehicle thefts in the country. But it isn't only the police force acting against the interests of the British people, but in fact the whole rotten judiciary. While scores of former government ministers and special advisors get away with embezzlement and corruption without facing any sort of justice, our judicial system is busy prosecuting the protesters who followed that BBC News reporter at that protest outside Downing Street last year. They've been ordered to carry out 200 hours of unpaid work. A 21-year-old girl who kicked at plastic police shields during the Kill the Bill riot in Bristol last year has been sentenced to 14 months in prison. In contrast with a less politically significant crime, a 23-year-old woman who lured a man into a kidnapping trap won't be serving any time in prison. In fact, 40% of repeat knife offenders avoid prison. Yet don't ever forget the 11-month custodial sentence imposed on Grenfell Tower volunteer Tara Ahmed for a Facebook post earlier this year. And now Alex Belfield's been sentenced to 5.5 years in prison for social media posts causing distress to Jeremy Vine and a number of vocal lockdown supporters. Say what you like about the guy, but 5.5 years in prison for an online feud? The judiciary don't serve the people, and justice certainly isn't applied equally. For example, Cornwall-based accountant Michael Adams was sentenced to 4 months of curfew during lockdown after being convicted of stealing 160 grand from HMRC last year. No prison time for stealing a 6-figure sum from the Treasury. That sounds awfully lenient, doesn't it? Well, not really when you realise he's linked to a company, the parent company of another company, which was recently awarded a public contract worth £70 billion to educate the public sector on the importance of net zero. I guess if you've got friends in high places and you're an active participant in the Great Embezzlement, you can get away with a lot more. But we all know that if it was any one of us peasant folk who stole 160 grand from the Treasury, we'd get a heck of a lot more than 4 months of curfew. To summarise, the whole system is a corrupt farce, and the sooner the British public realise that fact, the sooner we can save the nation from the oblivion it's drifting into. Now, as usual at this stage in the video, I'd like to thank everyone who's donated to the channel since my last upload. That's Duncan, Martin, Grendon, Avis, Heidi and Tom. Thank you all so much for your loyalty in spite of my absence. Speaking of which, if you've made it this far in the video, I feel I owe you an explanation as to where I've been. As I mentioned previously, I had an enormous amount going on in my personal life towards the end of last year and the start of this year. That, coupled with the amount of work that goes into each of my videos, all undertaken by one person, and for a diminishing reward, the whole process became completely unsustainable. I had to spend an amount of time considering my career, which had blown off into complete nothingness, and I reached the decision to take out another government loan and return to full-time education, which I will commence immediately after this video goes live. Unfortunately, Unfortunately, that means I won't be able to guarantee any sort of regular uploads for at least the remainder of 2022. Hence, I won't be including any of my donation links in the description of this video, as there's no point in you sending me money if I can't provide consistent uploads. But I'll be back a few months down the road. Until then, God bless you all, and thank you for watching.